Your Honor, Ms. Blaine Lewis, Ms. Fowler, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Well, we made it to the end. This is the last time that I can speak to you, and is the only time during the course of this trial when I can present to you the compelling reasons for your doubt to my alleged guilt. Now, as you know, the standard of proof, the prosecution's burden is that of beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond any and all reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt can come from one single piece of evidence, or it can come from the prosecution's lack of evidence. Now, the prosecution's theory of this case is that I committed the crime on April 13th at 7:37 a.m. and left within 23 minutes, drove to Parkwood Avenue, returned a rental car, and left town. Well, what we know is that the crime had to have happened between the hours of 7:37 a.m. and 12:50 p.m. when Deputy Megan Wilkes arrived. But there's no evidence of when the crime actually occurred within that window of time. The medical examiner, Dr. Bernard Ang, who testified as an expert witness, he had a lot to say about a lot of different topics, but when it came to the time of death, he didn't have anything to say. Now, the time of death is the time of the crime, of murder. There is no proof, one way or the other, that anybody left 120 Miller Road or entered the home after 7:37 a.m. There was not a single witness who said that the man who entered the house was me, including Elena Radin. Colin Franchini testified that the man was either white or Hispanic. She stated he arrived in the second white truck that passed by her. But the prosecution's theory is that the first white truck was the truck that I rented. However, nobody identified that truck on Miller Road. That truck was seen by LPR driving on New Scotland Road North, 1.1 miles away from the crime scene. But even if you accepted the prosecution's theory that I was the man who entered the house, you would have to believe that in 23 minutes, I entered the house, took off the victim's wrist brace, put a coat over him, bound his wrists with something like handcuffs, let the dog outside on the leash in the backyard, took him into the garage, tied him up with tape, beat and stabbed him repeatedly in a struggle so long and desperate it took Dr. Ang 15 minutes to describe, left in a white truck, came back in a white truck. I mean, what possible reason would that be? Naturally, would a cold-blooded killer return to the crime scene to leave more evidence to be seen by neighbors, the workmen next door? Now, please do not let the sheer volume of photos and videos distract you from the real issues at this trial. Time of death. Even if you accepted their theory, that person in the house they believe is me, they have not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the death of Philip Rabadi occurred in the time frame that they say that I would have been in the house. There is absolutely no forensic evidence linking me to the crime in my rental car, in my Toyota 4Runner, in the Airbnb I stayed at, or at 120 Miller Road. There is forensic evidence of other people. The tobacco pouch in the backyard, the cigarette butt next to the driveway, 3 partial DNA samples on the green tape and the black jacket that bound Mr. Rabadi. And when we first met 3 weeks ago, I asked if you believe that an innocent person could be arrested and indicted. And each and every one of you said yes. Well, after 3 weeks, we know why I was arrested and indicted. I made a very regrettable statement to Elena Radin in 2019. I called her a worthless piece of you-know-what. That was inexcusable. I followed up in 2021 with another big misfire. An embarrassing and awkward email in which I congratulated her, told her how proud of her I was, and attempted to apologize. And a few other things very poorly worded. And let's be honest, it's probably the most cringe email that has ever been sent. And on April 13th, in a moment of complete trauma, undoubtedly the worst moment of her life, she mentioned my name to police. Now, those words of Elena Radin were a catalyst to an investigation overwhelmed by tunnel vision and cognitive bias. They never considered any other suspect, never considered any other possibility. They ignored any piece of evidence that didn't fit their theory of the case. They ignored the tobacco pouch. They ignored the cigarette butt. They ignored the partial DNA on the victim. They ignored the white trucks on Miller Road that day. They ignored the time of death. But they also ignored the rigor mortis. The rigor mortis, the stiffening of skeletal muscle after death. That might be the most important piece of evidence in this case that raises a reasonable doubt. Now I want you to think back to the long testimony of Dr. Bernard Ang, the medical examiner. I'm actually going to implore you, when you are in deliberations, read what he said word for word. He stated on direct examination that the victim had circumferential bruises to both wrists. He believed the victim had been handcuffed prior to his death. He stated that it was likely handcuffs. He stated that of his observations, the victim's hands remained in the same place after the handcuffs were removed. He stated that was because of a phenomenon called rigor mortis, the stiffening of skeletal muscles after death. And I asked him on cross-examination, how long does it take for rigor mortis to set in? He said almost instantly in the tongue. So I got him to focus a little bit. I said, how long does it take rigor mortis to set in to the extremities? He said 30 minutes. So if the victim suffered rigor mortis that kept his hands in this position, according to Dr. Bernard, the handcuffs were removed after rigor mortis set in, which means the handcuffs had to have been removed 30 minutes after the victim died. Well, if the prosecution's theory that I was in the house for 23 minutes, how could that be possible? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about what would have happened, would have had to have happened prior to the victim's death. In 23 minutes, remove the wrist brace, bind the victim's hands, walk to the garage, black LL Bean jacket, green tape, altercation, time it takes to bleed out, 30 minutes for rigor mortis, handcuffs removed, and we are well above 23 minutes. It's impossible. By the prosecution's own expert witness, the medical examiner, the only person who could shed any light on what happened in that house, it's not possible. That is not just a reasonable doubt. That is unquestionably not guilty. That answers a lot of questions. Why was there none of my DNA at the crime scene? Why was none of the victim's DNA found in my rental truck? Why somebody else's DNA was on the body? Because when I returned to my Airbnb and my white Dodge Ram at 8:24 a.m., the crime probably hadn't happened yet. Well, besides the impossibility of doing all that in 23 minutes, and rigor mortis and all that, what else do we have? Well, we have the dog Murphy. And as you remember yesterday, Elena Rated testified that when she left her house that morning, the victim's dog was inside. She left for work, and when we see on the video at 7:37 a.m. of the crime scene, the two men walk inside and we hear a dog barking. But at 12:47, when Megan Wilkes arrives, the dog Murphy is in the backyard on his leash. So I was planning on showing you all the videos of the crime scene, when the dog came in, when the dog left. But I realized that's going to take several hours, so I'm going to implore you that when you go into deliberations, please watch the videos from the 114 Nest video between the hours of 6:30 a.m. and noon. You're going to see on the side camera and the front door camera Murphy outside for the first time at 9:28 a.m. You are going to see him come in and out every few minutes between 9:28 a.m. and noon. He's on camera a total of 23 times. But before 9:28 a.m., there is no evidence Murphy was outside. Now, I also want you to remember something. My white Dodge Ram was never identified at the crime scene. It was identified by the license plate reader 1.1 miles from the crime scene, driving on Newschannel Road North. But how many white trucks passed through the LRP that day? How many white trucks were on Miller Road that day? They have, at 396 New Scotland Road South, a camera that observes the entrance to Miller Road. It's not a motion sensor. It's on continuously. And you may remember me asking, Investigator Corey Andrus, Jason Cooper from the State Police, Senior Investigator Amy Kowalski, and Julie Horn if they had watched the videos from New Scotland Road South. Not one of them had watched the entire day's video. So you may have wondered why I kept asking that. Well, here's what they missed. If you begin watching that video at 10 a.m., you will see at 10:06 a.m. a white truck, four-door pickup truck, come off Miller Road, make a left, stop, and then back into a driveway that faces Miller Road. The truck remains there, facing Miller Road, till 11 a.m., 12 p.m., and then after police activity, after the sheriff's department shows up, after an ambulance shows up, person drives that vehicle back down Miller Road. Now, why were they there? I can't say. But what I can say is they hadn't been there before in the previous 4 days, because there's video from April 10th, April 11th, and April 12th. And you can watch 24 hours of the video. That white truck had never been there before. It backed up into the driveway and watched and waited to see what happened on Miller Road. That white truck was never investigated. No one knows why he sat there, watched and waited, and why he went back. Many of you might wonder or speculate, do killers like to wait and see what happens? Do killers like to return to the crime scene? I can't say that he did, can't say that he didn't, because no one investigated. No investigators looked into it. No investigators watched all the video to see what white trucks entered and what white trucks left. Now this is 30 minutes after Murphy is first outside when that white truck comes off Miller Road. And when you think about it, 38 minutes. What is 38 minutes? Well, we know it takes rigor mortis 30 minutes to set in. That fits into the time frame. That person could have killed Philip when the dog was let out. 30 minutes expires, removes the the handcuffs, and leaves. Waits and watches, and watches, and watches. And when police activity shows up, when the ambulance goes by, he goes back down the dead-end road. There's no other explanation for it. Now, it might be becoming more clear to you why no DNA linking me to the crime was ever found. But I want to rehash some of the DNA. We talked about an item, Prosecutions 91, item 48, SP 48, the nicotine pouch found in the woodpile in the victim's backyard. You heard Ms. Radin's testimony yesterday about a guy they hired to remove their trees who chewed tobacco. Now think about this for a moment. Sheriff's Deputy Lori Moore went to Enterprise Rent-A-Car and swabbed 2 of the employees for DNA. But they find a tobacco pouch at the crime scene, and they don't go and ask these gentlemen who work there for a DNA sample to rule out to see if it's his or not. Does that seem a bit odd to you? 18 months later, and John Doe 1 is still unidentified. And speaking of odd, do you remember the black glove that was found at the crime scene? Photographed, taken into evidence. 3 days into this trial of me asking questions about the black glove, why wasn't it tested? And then Tyler Young takes a stand and testifies that the glove was Megan Wilkes's. Well, that's odd, because she testified and never mentioned that. And if that was true or questionable, why wouldn't they have just tested the inside of the glove? They took a swab of her DNA. What's one more test to rule out a possible piece of evidence? Now I want to talk about prosecution's 122, or item 13, the cigarette butt next to the driveway. John Doe 3, the owner of the DNA in the cigarette butt, is still unidentified. And I seem to remember one of the slides we saw in a slideshow about cigarettes being purchased. Well, the cigarette of the crime scene had John Doe 3's DNA. Well, let's talk about the DNA found in the victim's body. We talked about this document, Defense M. This is the genotype worksheet that Lola Murray filled out. SP12EF, the front collar of the LL Bean jacket that the victim was found bound in. The jacket contained Philip's full DNA profile, but it contained extra genetic material that was not his. Lola Murray testified there was an extra 8 at TH01 and an extra 23 at FGA. She testified that these are two genes that I don't possess, two alleles I do not possess. Barring a mutation, I could not have contributed to the DNA found on the front collar of the jacket used to restrain the victim. Now, you may remember Elena Radin's testimony. She walked in, checked the pulse, grabbed the victim's shoulder, attempted to roll him, and then was pulled back by Megan Wilkes. No one ever touched the front collar of his jacket. So if that DNA is not Philip's, and it can't be mined, then whose is it? Now I want to talk about the tape, the green tape that bound the victim. SP11, AB, and EF. SPAB contained Philip's full genetic profile. There was an extra allele at TH01, an 8. I do not possess an 8. The DNA on that piece of tape could not have come from me. And it wasn't Philip's. Whose was it? SP11, EF. Again, another 8 at the locus of TH01. Lola Murray testified it could not have come from me. And this piece of tape has a 20, an extra 20 at FGA. Another allele that could not possibly have come from me. Now that's 3 pieces of partial DNA samples found on the victim that could not possibly have been mine. Now let's discuss the rental truck, the Dodge Ram that I rented, license plate 22553MN. None of the victim's DNA was found in that vehicle. There was one item, SP74A, a swab from the passenger side floor mat that had a positive leukomalachite green test, a test that they use for presumptive blood. But I want to remind you that forensic scientist Kimberly Stoddard testified that leukomalachite green is not specific for blood. Many things can cause false positives, including dirt, iron, vegetable peroxides, and mammalian blood. The follow-up DNA test was negative. And I want you to, if you please, look at the photos. Look at Dennis Round's photos of the truck. See if you see dirt on that floor mat. She testified that she did not test the dirt to see if the positive malachite green came from the dirt. But what was found in the rental truck? Jane Doe 3's fabric wipe, a woman who has nothing to do with Elena Radin or Philip Rabadi, and a receipt from the pet store that I went to on April 12th that reveals I bought a toy for my dog and dog treats. And then there's the search of 27 Parkwood. Nothing, not one speck of blood or DNA. This is the place that the prosecution alleges I walked into after having arrived after committing the crime. How could not a trace forensic particle have followed me from the crime scene? But of course, you know what they did find at Parkwood? A condom wrapper. Now I want to take a few minutes to discuss the testimony of Julie Horn and her demonstrative aids. She was brought in on April 18th, 2023, almost a year after the investigation began. After not one, not two, not three, but 4 negative rounds of DNA testing. She was brought on the investigation. She created a PowerPoint. But she also testified to cell phone pings. You heard her testimony about the timing advance system. She admitted she was not an engineer and couldn't go into specific details about how the system worked. But she stated it was 100% accurate because Verizon wants you to have the best coverage. And I painstakingly cross-examined her. And after a while, she admitted that a cell phone can be anywhere in the vector and not only in the red parts. And eventually, she admitted that a cell phone could even be a little bit outside the vector. So ask yourself this. In talking about this cell phone technology, why did the prosecution not call a Verizon engineer who could really explain this system to you? We still don't know the error accuracy rate of this timing advance system. And then I want to talk about the PowerPoint that you saw yesterday. When they got to an alleged email from my Gmail account, an alleged email from my Gmail account with no recipient, an email that says screwdriver and has the victim's license plate number in it. You got to be kidding me. When we think about this, I want to remind you of Luke Morris's testimony. He was a representative from Google. He testified that every email has a digital footprint, a unique hash number. Why has no one shown you the hash number of that email? What is the hash value for that email? What is its digital fingerprint? Why can't they tell you? That email doesn't even have a recipient. They have hash values for hundreds and maybe 1,000 emails in there. but they won't show you a hash value for that one. And if they are misleading you about that, what else could they be misleading about? Now I want to talk about the white pages search. Now you saw on the slide an email from whitepages.com. In the email, it says, Elena Radin, Manans, New York. Philip Rabadi, Albany, New York. Nowhere in the email does it say Slingerlands, New York, 120 Miller Road. But in prosecution's Exhibit 151 and 152, it does say that. If you look closely at the exhibit, that search was performed by Stephen Hank in September of 2023. They would have you believe that I knew where the victim and his wife lived based off that. But the email clearly states, Alana Radin, Manans, New York, Philip Rabadi, Albany, New York. I want to touch on some of the Google search histories. They showed you a search of how to breach a door with a shotgun. 7 months before the crime. But was there a door breached? Do I even own a shotgun? They showed you a search for swordsmith near me. Do I own a sword? Was a sword used? No. They showed you searches for Victor, New York, a suburb of Rochester. What does that have anything to do with Philip Rabadi or Elena Radin? They showed you a few searches for Albany, looking at Zillow, breweries, Drewers, Wolf's Beer Garden, Crossgates Mall. What does that have to do with the murder? And they showed you search histories from September to October 25th of 2021. Where are the searches from November all the way to April? I'm going to ask you, look at all the search history. You will see that after the time they alleged that I would have committed the crime, I searched for what states is weed legal in. And then you saw that I searched for news at Albany at 10 p.m. on the day the victim was murdered. 5 searches all at once. Now, if I had known about the crime prior to that, ask yourself, wouldn't I be searching like every hour, once or twice, to see when news was posted? But no. I searched 5 all at once. Had I just gotten some information from somebody, is it reasonable that if the husband of an ex-girlfriend were murdered, someone would let me know? Ask yourselves that. And ask yourselves, if I found out that police had been mentioning my name in regards to a homicide, what would I do?
Objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Stanley.
Thank you.
Mr. Stanley, objection.
Would a guilty person find someone to babysit his dog and then head back to New York to talk to authorities? Or would a guilty person drop his dog off and get on a flight to Argentina? Ask yourself that. And is my presence in Albany, New York that suspicious? The area code on my phone is 518. My Instagram nickname was WolfSpirit518. Why would me being in Albany have anything to do with a murder? Now again, the charge in this crime is murder in the 2nd degree. You heard from the pathologist, Dr. Eng, that it was a brutal and horrible bloody struggle between life and death. And Dr. Eng testified that Philip died to massive blood loss from a laceration of the carotid arteries and the jugular vein. According to the prosecution's theory, the killer would have had to get into a truck and drove away. How could it really be possible that there's not a single speck, a single trace amount of the victim's DNA? Are they going to tell you I was wearing a Tyvek suit? Not one hair fiber, not one skin cell, not one drop of sweat, like Lola Murray described. She stated, you only need 6 skin cells to obtain a DNA sample. She stated that the average human sheds tens of thousands of skin cells per day. She stated that only a tiny drop of sweat is required to get a DNA sample. How could no skin or sweat be transferred in the struggle that Dr. Eng described for you? Now, I want you to consider this. Dr. Eng's testimony. He described that struggle. He said that the victim had those T-shaped marks on the side of his head because he had been hit with the butt of the knife. Now, if you were to make a motion that hard to cause that amount of damage, your hand would take some of the brunt. In fact, maybe a lot of it. But when you saw my arrest, you saw the photos. I did not have a single bump, scrape, or bruise anywhere in my body. But I want to point out this picture in evidence. This is a picture of my hand during the arrest. You can see it turning beet red because the handcuff is cutting off circulation to my hand. During the arrest, I was compliant with officers. I did everything they asked. I went back to the car and I asked them, please remove the handcuffs or please adjust the handcuffs. You saw a video of me sitting in the back of a police car for 10 minutes squirming. And finally, they loosened the cuffs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has shown you lots of compilation videos depicting unidentified men and unidentified vehicles. The only place I was identified in this whole trial was by Elena Radin from a picture at Enterprise. But you can clearly see me walking outside Parkwood Avenue. You can see me in a camera on Fairview Avenue at 9:24 a.m. on April 13th, an hour plus after they allege I would have committed the crime. I'm casually walking my dog down the street. Now, does that seem like something a killer would do after committing a crime? Now, you heard of my arrest. You heard my friend Timothy Wynn take the stand and testify that I dropped my dog off with him and I was heading back to New York. He couldn't remember exactly what the conversation was. you heard a recording of me talking to him while incarcerated, talking about how much I miss my dog. You saw Amy Kowalski testify, and she unwrapped packages in front of you like it was Christmas and held up my sweater, half my wardrobe, and absolutely none of it had anything to do with the murder. There was not one speck of forensic evidence on any of my possessions linking me to the crime. They showed you my firearms, 2 9mm pistols. Those pistols were tested by ballistics, negative for being used in a crime. And the victim in this crime wasn't shot. He died from a laceration. Ask yourselves, if I wanted to kill somebody, why wouldn't I have just shot them? It doesn't make sense. Now, I know your time is precious. I don't want to take up too much more of it because I know how much you've already dedicated to this trial. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to ask you the same things I did when we started this trial. I'm going to ask you to please keep an open mind. I'm going to ask you to please grant me the presumption of innocence while you're deliberating. I'm going to ask you to please hold the prosecution to their burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you're looking over the evidence, and you see the reasonable doubt, please go back and review Dr. Eng's testimony about the rigor mortis that clearly puts me out of the window of the crime. Please look at the DNA reports. Please look at the genotype worksheets from Dr. Lola Murray. Please watch the videos from 114 Miller Road and see what time the dog first comes outside and how often the dog is outside on camera. Please watch the video of the white trucks on Miller Road, especially the truck that comes off Miller Road, parks across the street, turns around, and watches the entrance of Miller Road. I'm going to ask that when you look over the evidence and you find the reasonable doubt, you return a verdict of not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has not met their burden of proof. They didn't prove what time the crime happened. How could you be convinced of something beyond a reasonable doubt when there's no proof when the crime actually happened? They didn't prove that I was the man at the crime scene. They didn't show you a murder weapon. They didn't show you any forensic reports linking me to the crime. You can find reasonable doubt in the lack of evidence. And when you do, I expect that you're going to follow your oaths as to the standards of the law and return a verdict of not guilty. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Mr. Jury, we're going to take a 7-minute recess and allow the prosecutor an opportunity to set up and bring you back out here. Remember all the admonitions I gave you to discuss the case. I'm talking about the case.